Okay, let's jump right in today. We're looking at a really intense constitutional clash, basically over who controls military power within a state's borders.
Yeah, this isn't just theory. We're talking actual boots on the ground, the National Guard, and a major showdown between the White House and Oregon.
Right, so our mission today is to really dig into the source material around President Trump's order,
Mm.
the one federalizing Oregon National Guard troops during those protests in Portland.
hmm
We need to unpack the facts, look at the completely different stories coming from federal officials versus state officials.
And the legal side, too. The implications there are huge. And
But-
the money involved.
Exactly, the legal and financial stakes. This could be a real landmark case for, that balance of power.
And it kicked off immediately. I mean, this wasn't just some minor disagreement. You've got 200 Guard troops ordered into federal service.
For 2 months.
For 2 months, yeah. Pulled from the governor's control, put under the president's command.
Which Oregon's leaders, the governor, mayor, attorney general, they saw this as what? A hostile takeover.
Pretty much. They didn't just resist, they fought it legally, politically, publicly, on all fronts.
It really highlights that weird dual nature of the Guard, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's a state force, but also a federal reserve.
Precisely. It's like the state police, but the federal government can sort of requisition them if they decide the situation fits certain criteria.
Okay, so let's start with the federal trigger. What exactly was the action, and what was the official story?
The order was very specific. 200 Oregon National Guard troops, federalized 60-day activation.
And the location.
The focus was those protests happening outside a U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement facility, the ICE building in Portland.
Right. Federal property, federal officers.
Yeah.
That was the core of the White House claim for needing protection.
Yes. And the language used to justify it was potent.
Yeah, the sources show President Trump on social media calling Portland a never-ending disaster, really painting a picture of chaos.
And claiming federal officers were facing, I think the quote was, vicious attacks, which, implies a need for a military-level response.
That framing seems really important for the legal side later.
Absolutely critical, because they need to justify it legally. And this order, it didn't come out of the blue. There was an ultimatum first.
An ultimatum. From who?
From the National Guard Bureau officials. They sent us a memo basically saying Oregon had 12 hours to deploy its own guard.
Or else.
Or else, yeah. They warned that not acting would, quote, risk lives and property damage, setting the stage for federal action.
So basically, handle it our way right now, or we'll take over and handle it for you.
Yeah, that's the gist. They were trying to build the case that there was an immediate emergency, something beyond normal policing.
Creating that narrative of crisis, an almost insurrection-like situation.
That seems to be the strategy, yes, to meet that high legal bar for federal intervention.
But then you have Oregon's view, which sounds completely different. What was Governor Kotek saying?
She pushed back immediately, flatly refused the federal ultimatum.
And her reasoning.
She argued the protests just didn't warrant military intervention at all, certainly not intervention ordered from Washington, D.C.
Did she suggest why the feds might be pushing so hard then?
She did. She actually accused the administration of exaggerating the unrest, basically for political gain.
Ah, the idea that it was more about creating a spectacle than solving a real security issue.
That was the accusation, yes, a very serious one.
And does the local picture back that up? What did the mayor, Keith Wilson, say?
His response was pretty blunt. When asked how many troops were needed at the ICE facility protests, he just said 0.
Wow, 0 versus 200, that's stark.
It really is. And that contrast, it's probably the most crucial detail in the sources we have.
What did the actual police report show?
Well, according to Portland police, the protests usually involve only a few dozen participants, not massive crowds.
Okay, a few dozen. And arrests.
This is key. No arrests in recent weeks tied specifically to those ICE facility demonstrations.
No arrests in recent weeks. That really undercuts the vicious attacks and never-ending disaster narrative, doesn't it?
It certainly seems to. If local police are managing with small numbers and no recent arrests, deploying 200 federalized troops looks, disproportionate.
Maybe even punitive, as the governor suggested.
It raises that question, definitely. Why the military response to what locals described as pretty low-level stuff? Which brings us to the legal fight.
Because Oregon didn't just complain. They sued. The Attorney General, Dan Rayfield.
Wasted no time. Filed suit in federal court straight away.
And the core argument. What's the legal basis for Oregon's challenge?
It's fundamentally about the Constitution. They argued the president's order went beyond his authority and stepped on state sovereignty.
How so? What specific power were they challenging?
It all comes down to the Insurrection Act, an old law from 1807.
Okay, the Insurrection Act. Let's pause there. Why is that specific law so central here? And why don't we hear about it very often?
Well, it's rarely used. It dates back to the early republic, updated around the Civil War. It gives the president the power to deploy federal troops or federalize the National Guard, like here, for domestic issues.
But not just for anything, right? There are conditions.
Exactly. The language is specific. The president can act in cases of invasion or insurrection, or when state authorities can't maintain order, but usually that's at the state's request.
So Oregon's argument is essentially a few dozen protesters, no recent arrests. This is not an insurrection.
Precisely. They're challenging the federal government's definition. If the president can just call something an insurrection, even if it doesn't look like one on the ground,
Then the limits on that presidential power kind of disappear.
that's the fear. It undermines the state's control over its own guard forces. Oregon was fighting to keep that definition strict, to keep the bar high for federal military intervention domestically.
That makes sense. It's a potentially huge precedent if they win, right? It could limit future presidents.
Definitely. And they wanted to move fast. They immediately asked the court for what's called a TRO.
A temporary restraining order, like an emergency stop button.
Exactly. To block the federalization and deployment before it actually happened. They argued it would cause irreparable harm, mess up the state's command structure, cost a fortune.
So the court hearing on that TRO was pending right after the lawsuit was filed.
Yes, it was urgent. They knew once those troops were officially under federal command and possibly deployed, it gets much harder to undo.
A race against the clock, basically.
It really was. And, that mention of cost brings us to the financial side, which is often overlooked but was definitely part of Oregon's argument.
Right, beyond the big constitutional questions, there's a practical cost. What was the estimated price tag for federalizing just those 200 troops for 60 days?
The Oregon Military Department put the estimate at up to $10 million.
$10 million. For something the mayor said needed 0 troops.
$10 million. Covers salaries, benefits, lodging, food, supplies, transport. The whole logistical operation for 200 personnel for 2 months.
Okay, but who pays that $10 million? If the federal government orders it under the Insurrection Act, does the state still get stuck with the bill?
That's a great question. Typically, under Title X federal control, the federal government picks up the tab eventually. But the state often has to cover initial costs, deal with the bureaucracy.
Ah, so it's still a burden, even if they get reimbursed later.
Right. And by publicizing that $10 million figure, Oregon is making another point. They're highlighting how potentially wasteful this federal action is, given their assessment of the actual threat.
So the cost becomes another weapon in their argument. It frames the federal action as maybe excessive, maybe politically driven, not based on real security needs.
Exactly. It connects the sort of high-level constitutional debate back to something concrete, state resources and taxpayer money.
So stepping back to the situation on the ground then, at the time this legal battle was kicking off, did those 200 federalized troops actually show up in Portland? Was there a visible military presence?
Our sources say no, not at that point. The Oregon Guard officials confirmed the troops were still going through processing, maybe some required training, before any deployment could happen.
So the lawsuit landed before the deployment was complete?
Yes, which was critical. It gave the courts a window to potentially pause everything before it became a physical reality on the streets.
That timing feels crucial. It really sums up the whole conflict, doesn't it? You have the loud federal declaration of crisis, maybe even insurrection.
Versus the state saying, hold on, look at the actual numbers, look at the lack of arrests, look at this massive $10 million bill for something locals say isn't needed.
It really boils down to who gets to define reality in a domestic situation like this.
And Oregon seemed to have a pretty sophisticated strategy, attacking it legally by questioning whether the facts even met the criteria for the Insurrection Act.
So the big takeaway here, for you listening, seems to be that the balance of power over these state-controlled military assets is, well, really delicate. And a president declaring an emergency, even with an old law like the Insurrection Act, doesn't automatically get a free pass, especially when local officials are showing evidence that contradicts the crisis narrative.
Yeah, the courts really become the referee in deciding if the rhetoric actually matches the legal requirements.
Which leads us to a final thought, something for you to mull over. If the courts do side with Oregon here, if they set a precedent, making it harder to use the Insurrection Act?
Hmm.
Could that create a kind of perverse incentive down the line? Imagine a governor facing a real major crisis, genuine, severe unrest.
Okay.
Might they be tempted to deliberately downplay how bad things are?
Yeah.
Underreport the severity, just to avoid federal intervention because they don't want to lose control or face the political heat?
That's an interesting thought. So fighting federal overreach in one case could potentially lead to states being hesitant to ask for necessary help in another?
Possibly making a dangerous situation worse, just to protect state sovereignty.
Yeah, that adds a whole new layer of complexity, doesn't it? A risk calculation for state leaders.
Definitely something to think about as these kinds of federal-state tensions continue. Thanks for diving deep with us today.